let's talk next about economic geography in Southeast Asia. And if you recall, in East Asia, we talked about the Asian tigers. And there were four. Three that we've discussed previously: South Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. And the fourth is the small island country of Singapore. And there's also a concept called the new Asian tigers. And so, while Singapore and the others are well established, because Singapore is so small, it's kind of a hub, and it's now kind of the hub where businesses, instead of setting up factories in Singapore, will set up their home base there, their corporate office, and then manufacturing has kind of spilled over into neighboring countries, including Thailand, Malaysia, Philippines, and Indonesia. I kind of did them in the wrong order. So we got Malaysia here, we have Indonesia, we have the Philippines, and we have Thailand. And because of the recent growth in Vietnam, Vietnam should properly be considered a new Asian tiger as well. And one thing important, and what's important about Singapore is that Singapore is an important break of bulk point, that it's a place where goods must be transported from one form of transportation to the other. In fact, it has one of the largest port container facilities in the world. So it is a hub of shipping between different parts of Asia. And that's one reason. This is Singapore in the background, and this is its port facility. And shipping, particularly containerized shipping, and where it is in the world, has really made it a bustling port. So if we look at, let me kind of go back a bit. All right, so this is a little bit, the figure that's in the book currently is a little different than this, but I kind of like the old figure to kind of illustrate a trend that's been happening with trade in Southeast Asia. And so this is looking at the year 2000 versus the year 2012. This is where things were going, exports. And in the year 2000, most of the exports from Southeast Asia were going to either Japan or to the United States. When we look at what's happening in 2012, exports continue to go to Japan, but much more are going to China. Likewise with imports to Southeast Asia, where most of them had previously come from Japan, that is now switching to China. So we talked about the rise of China as an economic power, and as that's happened, China has kind of shifted a lot of the trade that used to be done with Japan and the United States has now been shifting to China over time. And so China is really exerting a lot more economic control in this part of the world, particularly Southeast Asia. And I don't think I'm going to go over this in detail because I'm going to include a video that kind of explains the same thing and does it well. But very briefly, we want to talk about who controls the water off the coast, especially with these island countries, right? Like the Philippines, Indonesia. How much control do they have over the waters off of their coast? And there's a couple of concepts. There's a territorial sea that's right next to your coast. And then outside of that, we have what are called the high seas, international waters. And, how much control do you have over which part? One concept I'll mention, kind of a physical geography concept, is that countries, the land doesn't just end at the water's edge. It actually continues underwater in what's called the continental shelf. Then later that drops off and goes into more of a deep ocean. And so these have changed over time. During the colonial era, the countries only controlled a small part of the ocean off their waters, off their coast. But in the 1940s, sort of during the Cold War period, there was what's called the scramble for the oceans, where the United States claimed a larger, about 200 miles off of its coast, especially in places where it had a wide continental shelf and oil resources. And so, you know, this needed to be settled by different countries. So what was established is an agreement called the United Nations Conference of Law on Sea. And what it says is that every country has 12 miles that they totally control, right? Everybody has to stay out pretty much. But on top of that, they have an additional, what they have is a 200-mile, what they call EEZ, or exclusive economic zone. This is where countries, although they're not supposed to prevent, you know, ships can go through there and things like that, but the countries have economic rights. They can fish there, they can get oil from there, that they have control over the economic resources within 200 miles off their coast. All right, and so I want to mention that first to bring up the concept of something called the 9-dash line. Right, there's a lot going on here, but so if you look at that 200-mile exclusive economic zone, this green line would be that for the Philippines. This one here would be the one for Vietnam. This one here would be that for Malaysia. And under the United Nations law, that's what they should be controlling as far as fishing, oil, and so on. However, China just kind of is doing its own thing. In 2009, published this map that called the 9-dash line. It's like 1, 2, 3, you know, it had 9 dashes. And so what China was saying is that we don't care about that UN law because we controlled this sea historically. China is like laying claim to the South China Sea. And the problem is that what China is claiming that it controls overlaps with what other countries should be controlling. And so this is a point of tension in this part of the world. So the Philippines think that it controls up to here, whereas China thinks it controls much of that area. And I'll include a video that kind of explains this. So, however, it's not just China saying that, but they are doing some actions to try to back this up. So what they're doing is they're finding small islands out in within that 9-dash line area and fortifying them, building small military bases to reinforce their claims on this part of the South China Sea. Now, and this has led to tension, including with the United States. So what the United States tends to do is kind of ignore it. It sends ships through there, it flies overhead. And this is a point of military tension between the United States and China. I'll include a video that kind of explains this a little better.